Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. Here's Socks cleaning himself on my desk, and we've just got in from doing some shopping. A little bit of a trip out, mostly to buy snacks for book club tomorrow night, so we can gather around and discuss Remarkably Bright Creatures on Thursday night. But today is Wednesday and it's a bit steamy outside because it's been raining, and suddenly it's got warm and sunny again, so it's slightly over warm, and we've got washing clean shirts hanging everywhere around the house trying to dry out, so the whole place is slightly steamy. I've just seen a goldfinch on our tree. Anyway, Socks is noisy, a bit noisy today. He was up a lot of the night, stuck outside in the rain. I don't know why. I don't know if something's going on with the cat flap, but I was awake, worried that Socks was lost somewhere, as if he could get lost outside. And eventually I went downstairs and opened the back door, and he came pelting in, soaking wet, at whatever it was, 3:45 in the morning. So I didn't sleep much last night because of cat dramas. Eventually, after eating and mooching about, he came and lay in my arms again and fell asleep till morning. I don't think it caused any more palaver after that. So I hope nothing's gone wrong with our cat flap. It's a special cat flap, and one that we renewed last year with the microchip reader in, so only Socks can use it, which is good because we've got various cats who try to get into the house all the time. They've obviously heard what soft touchers we are around here. Okay, I've got a tiny amount of book shopping from this afternoon in Cheadle. Books found their way to me. And I've got a reading catch up of things I've been reading this week. My big news is that I finished a first draft of a story, of a script that needs doing for this project, and there's 3 parts to it, which I'm going to do through the year. But the first part I've drafted all the way through in 2 weeks, which is good working, I think. I've given every morning over to this and ploughed into this story, and quite enjoyed actually getting to write it after a year of working on the outline, a full year of sending the outline backwards and forwards. Hello, Socks. Anyway, so it's been quite effective to spend 2 weeks writing words every morning, usually about 1,400 words. For those people interested in my working methods, that's ideal, I think, to spend a morning and write 1,400 words. And they're like building blocks. This is Lego. So you get whatever that means by the end of the week, usually about 6,000 words by the end of that. I don't know if that arithmetic works out. I'll have to look that up. Anyway, book haul first. Well, first thing is that I didn't mention this last week. This Pan book arrived in my hands in a out-of-town retail park charity shop. They have these kind of big charity shops now, and this is over towards Salford, when we had our day out in Salford and sat in the sun with orange juice at the Salford Quays. We also went to I don't know what shop it was, but it's near the Sainsbury's we used to use when we lived that way. That Sainsbury's was great because we'd go very late at night because it was open till midnight, and we'd always bump into people from Coronation Street because they all lived that way because of the studios. We'd always bump into Audrey Roberts, who always said hello. Anyway, this was there, 50p for one of these anthologies. I've read the second one. It's called Spectrum and published by Pan, edited by Kingsley Amis and Robert Conquest. The second one I remember being really good. This is the third one, and it begins with a story by Theodore Sturgeon called Killdozer, which I believe became a novel afterwards. But I sat in Sainsbury's car park when Jeremy was buying ciggies. Listen to this for an opening. Killdozer. It kind of tells you everything about AI that you need and want to know, and everything about why AI is a terrible idea. Before the race was the deluge, and before the deluge another race, whose nature it is not for mankind to understand, not unearthly, not alien, for this was their earth and their home. There was a war between this race, which was a great one, and another. The other was truly alien, a sentient cloud form, an intelligent grouping of tangible electrons. It was spawned in mighty machines by some accident of a science beyond our aboriginal conception of technology. And then the machines, servants of the people, became the people's masters, and great were the battles that followed. The electron beings had the power to warp the delicate balances of atom structure, and their life medium was metal, which they permeated and used to their own ends. Each weapon the people developed was possessed and turned against them, until a time when the remnants of the vast civilization found a defense. An insulator, the terminal product or byproduct of all energy research. Neutronium. In its shelter they developed a weapon. What it was we shall never know, and our race will live. Or we shall know, and our race will perish as theirs perished. Sent to destroy the enemy, it got out of hand, and its measureless power destroyed them with it, and their cities, and their possessed machines. The very earth dissolved in flame, the crust writhed and shook, and the oceans boiled. Nothing escaped it, nothing that we know as life, and nothing of the pseudo-life that had evolved within the mysterious force fields of their incomprehensible machines, save one hardy mutant. I won't go on about the hardy mutant that survives, but it kind of knocked my socks off reading that, because I've talked to so many people who are quite excited about AI, people I wouldn't have expected to be bothered about it, writers, people who I think should know better than to place any trust whatsoever in something that just steals people's work and boils it down to the lowest common denominator into a kind of porridgey mulch of mediocrity, because that's what I see this AI stuff producing, a kind of mass unconscious sludge. Anyway, there's good old Theodore Sturgeon warning us from back in the 1950s. And of course, the satirical science fiction of the 1950s, the political science fiction of the 1950s, is something to be very alert to, because they were writing with memories of fascism and the war and all the things that need to be consigned to history. They remembered what all that stuff is about. Don't hand your intelligence over to demagogues and machines. It's a bad thing to do. People are doing that all the time at the moment, and they should be reminded of what people who'd been through the war, people who were writing in the 1950s, which they should remember the conclusions they came to with their science fiction. Science fiction is a good place to look for the answers to what is going on in the world right now, because people like Theodore Sturgeon, Philip K. Dick, Kurt Vonnegut, they knew what was going on. They knew what it was all about. Anyway, there's a rant. It just really stood out to me when I read that. What I've been reading in the past week, since I had my socks knocked off by the octopus book, which I've talked about before at length, I know. That's Shelby Van Pelt's Remarkably Bright Creatures. I really recommend it. It's one of my books of the year, and I will talk later this week about my favourite books of June, but also I want to talk about my best books of the year so far, because it's the middle of the year. In the week since, I've reread two books that I read as a kid, which seems like a very summary thing to do, to go back to some kids' books. And these are from before I went to university. Lloyd Alexander, The Book of Three, the first part of the Chronicles of Prydain, his kind of riff on Welsh mythology. that became a Disney movie in, I think, 1980, which I remember from the time, which was dark and gloopy and wonderfully colourful. Sometime in the 1980s, as a teenager, I read this first book, and I think maybe the second, The Black Cauldron, and all I remembered was the atmosphere. And I read this again this week, and almost didn't finish it because the middle bit gets a bit stodgy. There's a bit of running about and toing and froing in the middle that gets a bit dull. But then suddenly the characters cohere and we get this band of wonderful characters who are working together. And it's funny, you know, they're sparky. It has elements that you can see David Eddings took for his Belgariad books. And you can see bits that this shares with Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. But yeah, I enjoyed it, and I've got the others waiting now in a pile together to finish off so I can go further into the series. It's very touching. I love, is it Hen Wen, the pig, the oracular pig that has all the answers to everything, and he keeps going missing. And Gurgi, who's a kind of similar to Gollum in The Hobbit, really, but he's nicer. He's a nice Gollum who turns out to be terribly loyal and everything. And when he gets injured, it's really hurtful when something happens to Gurgi and they save him. They're a band of heroes who quabble and the rest of it squabble. Quabble. Quabble's not a word, is it? They squabble and they argue. They quarrel and they squabble. And but in the end, they're terribly nice to each other. Their loyalty is important, and that's very important in adventure stories, I think, that we feel that this is a gang who are together because they want to be. And then I reread something I read when I was 14 the first time. Terry Pratchett's The Colour of Magic, the first in his famous Discworld series. I read this when it first came out. And then I read it again when I was about 38 on a trip to New York. I read the first two books, intending to kind of get further in the series. And I never have managed to get any further in the series. I don't know why. I was always put off by something. As a teenager, I don't know what that was. Later on, I was put off because Pratchett once came to UEA to talk to everyone and was quite rude and not that much fun to be around. We took him out for dinner and he was quite difficult, really. And looking back, I can see that he probably put his defences up thinking that he'd been invited to be amongst a whole lot of snooty university people who he felt might look down on him. But the fact was, we'd asked him to come because we knew that people really loved his work, and we loved the fact that he would be talking to people who were really into what he did. And, you know, it was with full respect. But he didn't think much of kind of academics and accused us all of being ignorant to do with science fiction and fantasy, which wasn't true at all. Anyway, that stuck in my mind for quite a while. I do remember reading the chapter in a lovely book by Bob Fisher about going to science fiction conventions called Whiffle Lever to Full. It's a really lovely book about fandoms, and he writes a chapter about a Terry Pratchett convention where Pratchett takes part in about 2007. And he describes the fandom around these Discworld books, and it's a really lovely chapter. And that, more than anything, makes you want to try to get back to the books. I had this complete epiphany reading this week about this being a genre I love. Comic fantasy has always been a genre I loved, whoever was writing it. Whether I'm thinking of Kurt Vonnegut doing The Sirens of Titan, or Douglas Adams, or more recently Travis Bardi doing Legends and Lattes. The subversion of science fiction and fantasy is something I adore and have done since I was a kid, watching late period Tom Baker on Doctor Who. This surprised me because there was so much of it I'd forgotten. It's a very stop and start kind of affair. I love the characters, always did love Rincewind, the kind of slightly shabby and cowardly wizard, and Two Flower, the tourist who's a complete innocent, and his voracious luggage, his trunk on many legs that eats people and seems to be dimensionally transcendental. But I'd forgotten that it was in episodes, and I'd forgotten what the episodes were, and that they didn't really connect. It's just this what's the word? Picaresque series of adventures, and I like it more for that. Although it's an early novel, you can tell he'd written other things before this, I think, but it's the first in this series, and people say that he hasn't settled into his rhythm yet. And what he's doing is what lots of us do in our early books, and fling everything against the wall. Lots of ideas, lots of jokes, lots of silliness, everything we can think of. Almost like it's the only time you'll get to do this. And maybe he gets to space himself out and stretch a bit more in later ones. I hope so. It's a bit choppy, I guess. That's the word I would use for it. We don't get to relish the adventure of it so much. It's caught up in not just amusing us, it's caught up in impressing us, I think. So I am going to push on and read the ones that friends of mine have suggested I might like. But I've also looked into other comic fantasy writers who I've read before but have forgotten about. And I was looking back at the 80s and 90s and realising that these people like Robert Asprin or Craig Shaw Gardner or Jasper Fforde, Tom Holt, I've read them, but I'd forgotten I'd read them. And there is this whole strand of comic fantasy through my reading, which I think I need to value more. I think I need to try and put it together like a jigsaw. Anyway, shopping today is quite scattershot in the shops of Cheadle. What have I got to show you? Another of these, is it Marshall Cavendish? The Great Writers series. Somebody asked about this the other day because they're on my shelf behind me. So who published them? It was Heinemann. Oh, it's Marshall Cavendish Part Works. And there's a whole bunch of them there with a gold thing on their binding. And I've got a good bunch of them there now. I've been buying them in charity shops as I've seen them in recent months. They came out when I first went to university. It's a fairly middle-brow series. It's one of those things where it's the great writers, and here's a hardback every issue, and you've got the magazine, and the magazine would be about the life of Thomas Hardy, and with it you'd get a hardback of Tess of the D'Urbervilles, and it would be $2.99 or something, or maybe $3.99. And they were beautifully made. They were really heavy, lovely hardbacks, and a nice magazine. And I got one or two in the summer, I think, of 1988. And then I went to university, and of course, because I was going there on the bus, the Primrose coach that went over the hills, over the Pennines, for 100 miles, with only the bags I could carry. What I took to university was just the essentials. I took 10 paperbacks, 10 favourite paperbacks. So I couldn't be carrying heaps of Marshall Cavendish hardbacks of the classics. Also, there's the expense. Spending that much every fortnight on these books that weren't on my courses was absolutely not the idea. I had to buy my course books, which were all from the 1950s and 60s, because our course was on post-war fiction and poetry. And I also felt maybe they were a bit middle-brow because they were so avowedly classics. It wasn't quite the thing for me at 18 to be reading that was the next year, the kind of 19th century classics. Anyway, I stopped buying them. And I always regretted it years afterwards. I regretted not having a whole lovely collection of the Marshall Cavendish books. And so in recent years, I've been buying them when I've found them for a decent price. Obviously, these things are on eBay or whatever for loads of money. And sometimes you get bargains, but I don't want to buy them all in one flash. I don't want it to be that easy. I like it when you turn up and you find them for a couple of quid in a charity shop. That's the fun way of doing it. And today, for $2.99, look at this, War of the Worlds, H.G. Wells, with, as Jeremy points out, an image taken from the Jeff Wayne War of the Worlds LP in 1978. Something that the book should always have had on its cover, I think, since that LP came out. The LP that marked a generation of kids. I love War of the Worlds. I love it in its record form. I love it in its film version, the original film version, not the Tom Cruise one. And I love it as a book. They gave me a copy once, a presentation copy in Darlington Library when I was 16. They had a competition for drawing comic strips, and I won the oldest category. And I did a huge Doctor Who comic strip based on the brain of Morbius, and they filled a whole cupboard with it. And they said, step into the TARDIS and read Paul's comic strip. And then they gave me a copy of, I think, The Time Machine and War of the Worlds in one volume, as if they were encouraging me to read beyond Doctor Who, which was very kind of them. But of course, I'd already read H.G. Wells by then. It has that wonderful beginning that Richard Burton memorably reads on the record. No one would have believed in the last years of the 19th century that human affairs were being watched keenly and closely by intelligences greater than man's, and yet as mortal as his own. That as men busied themselves about their affairs, they were scrutinized and studied, perhaps almost as narrowly as a man with a microscope might scrutinize the transient creatures that swarm and multiply in a drop of water. It was something I'd hoped to return to because of the Puffin Classics for Doctor Who that I've been writing each year. I really wanted to do a version of War of the Worlds and set it in the kind of swinging 60s with Patrick Troughton's Doctor. But they've canned that series. That's one of the things that I was doing that's been brought to a halt after 8 volumes. My Doctor Who Dracula is the last one. They're doing 2 sets of audiobooks, which is great. There's going to be audiobooks of those Puffin Classics at last, but only because they think of the whole thing as wound up and rounded off as a series of 8 books, which is nice. I've written half of the 8. I've written 4 of the 8, which is really nice. But I did hope to carry on, especially when I thought earlier this year, wouldn't War of the Worlds be a great story to muck around with in Doctor Who terms? But anyway. And then from another shop, David Lodge. I'm slowly buying Puffin David Lodge's. I've never read him, but I've been told I need to. And I don't know why I've missed out on reading him. They had a sale on in Bernardo's vintage shop, and everything was half price and half price again. So these were kind of 25 pence or 12.5 pence. The 2 girls at the counter who were, they looked as if they'd never heard of such a thing as half a pence. I had to explain it to them. And a cookery book, a vintage cookery book called Cooking with Love by Leslie Sellers, which was 12.5p. There are all manner of cookery books, it says. It looks like a 70s thing to me. For experts and amateurs, for duchesses in stately homes and bachelors and bedsitters, and for meat-eaters and vegetarians, for tin openers and people who only eat compost-grown vegetables gathered within the previous hour. There are also manuals for people who hate cooking and for seducers, guides to regional cooking, dictionaries of sausages and what to do with them. A dictionary of sausages sounds like a kind of fancy literary novel, an Alan Hollinghurst novel probably. And rundowns on the best things to eat in bed or on fishing expeditions. This book deals with none of these rarefied things. It is written by someone who likes cooking for other people who like cooking. It is a These Have I've Loved of recipes. It is intended to be read from beginning to end like a novel and then put aside till the moment the reader thinks, I'll have a go at making that. That's all, but it's enough. That's my kind of blurb. And it's got lovely cartoons. This is a bit like Flowery Fingers, the Faber cookery book that I bought earlier this year. I'm going to have a nice collection of vintage and forgotten cookery books, I think. Right, that's everything I bought on my travels today and everything I've been reading. I've began Eragon, another thing I read before. I read this when it came out in 2005, and I remember 2007. I remember nothing about it at all, apart from dragons. So I thought, while I'm in a kind of epic fantasy mood, I would look at that again. And if it doesn't take, I'll go on to something else. But I've cleared myself some space to read, which is such a relief on a slightly sultry day. I got a copy edit note back on a piece of work where they said sultry wasn't appropriate, assuming that sultry meant somehow just sexy. And it doesn't. It's a neutral term, really. It doesn't necessarily mean sexy. It just means warm, I think. Anyway, quibbles with copy editors. It's just a part of life when you're a writer. I think I've said before that I once answered back to copy editors when I said that, well, this is a book for 8 to 12-year-old people, and that's when I really loved language and loved learning new words, and I'm sure I'm not the only one. And that the words that the Doctor Who books taught me were words like capacious and voluminous and dimensionally transcendental, words that stayed with me forever. And just like words themselves, these words mean bigger on the inside than the outside. And books and words have to be that too. I think if words are smaller on the inside, if they mean just one thing, if they're just simple, that's no good. Words have to fire our imagination, especially when we're younger readers. But it's true of everyone. And I love learning new words still. In fact, there was something earlier today, but it's gone. Anyway, goodbye. Socks has fallen asleep on my lap, of course, at the sound of my voice. I sent him to sleep. I hope I haven't sent you to sleep. Goodbye, and I will see you all again quite soon.